So let's talk about some stealthy Phobos and some armoured Dreadnought Might, as it seems that a few more Space Marine rules have appeared on the internet, with some more detachment leaks for the Astartes. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marine Codex once more, and it seems that in a follow-up to the leaks that we had around about a week or so ago, there's now a few more rules blowing in on the winds of the internet. This one focuses around the Iron Hands and Raven Guard type rules for the Codex. I believe that they're the last two rules that neither Games Workshop nor the previous leaks have mentioned at all. It seems that at the moment the Space Marine Codex probably isn't all that far away. I wouldn't be too surprised if they announced it going up for pre-order the Saturday after this one coming. I guess we'll find out for sure about that on Sunday, but usually they don't tend to preview rules for their codexes until they're at least fairly close. That seems to happen with about a good half of Games Workshop's rules publications. It looks like we're getting rules that are leaking out a little bit before Games Workshop intend, and this one supposedly comes from the same source as the previous one over on Discord. Seemingly content enough to give us small teasers of the new detachments coming up. They're not leaking entire full rule sets out and out, so annoyingly we still don't know the full picture yet, though my guess is it won't be long either via official previews or if we get a full book leak. As always with these leaks, they're definitely not 100% confirmed, definitely just treat them as interesting rumours and teasers until we know for sure, though I would guess that they're probably going to be accurate if they do indeed come from the same person as last time. That did seem to tally up pretty well with Games Workshop's own previews. They did predict the Oath of Moment change. In any case, I'd guess that we probably won't have too long before we know about this for certain. Games Workshop previewed the first few detachments on Monday. I'd guess that we'll get more like that either tomorrow or the day after, or next Monday I suppose. In any case, the interesting stuff this time round are a few more details out of the two last mystery detachments. The Raven Guard one supposedly named the Vanguard Spearhead, and the Iron Hands themed one apparently named the Ironstorm Spearhead. I'm not sure if we've even seen those names officially confirmed by GW though. Just as a small aside before we get into the main leaks today, while we're on the subject of Space Marines, I would just like to quickly mention the channel giveaway. For the October one, I thought I'd go for 3 sets of basically all the new Space Marine miniatures coming out alongside the Codex, so Terminators, Chapter Heroes and Veterans, Scouts and Jump Intercessors, along with a copy of the Codex itself. Stick around for the end of the video where I'll talk a little bit more about how to enter for those if you want to be in with a chance. First up, let's talk about Armoured Might and Big Damage with the Ironstorm. According to the last leak, this is supposedly one that's vaguely themed around Iron Hands and has generally got support for Space Marine vehicles and walkers. Though it seems like a fair few of the others, the detachment rule doesn't really seem to be locked to any one class of unit at all. It's apparently a kind of equivalent of Master Artisans, allowing to reroll either 1 hit roll, 1 wound roll, or 1 damage roll per unit per phase, and apparently that will apply at both range and melee. Definitely not a bad rule overall, Space Marines but with a little bit more damage. I guess the rerolls might be a little bit more relevant now the Oath of Moment gets toned down a bit, and that could still mean that this rule comes into effect a bit on the wound reroll, whereas other times for units targeting the Oath of Moment target it otherwise would have been wasted. Whenever you get these single reroll type things, they'll generally favour smaller units with single high power anti-tank type shots, perhaps things like a tank with a single big gun on it, or a multi-melter or a las cannon in a smaller Space Marine squad ideally. If other Divergent chapters could use this one, it actually seems like it could be weirdly good for Black Templars with their multi-melter equipped tanks, plus the ability to take those Firstborn Crusader squads with cheap 65.5 man Marine squads with las cannons. Otherwise, I guess things like Predator Annihilators or las cannon Devastators might particularly like this, or maybe things like the Repulsor Executioner Laser Destroyer that could get a lot of value out of one roll. Seems pretty helpful that this works in combat as well. That'd be good for character melee or sergeants with hidden power fists within units. Does maybe slightly feel like the Iron Hands are stealing the Salamanders thing here, rather than their classic feel no pain for bionics that they've often had. For a bit more vehicle support, the leak mentioned 1 enhancement, and unfortunately 1 enhancement only, but this one's apparently some sort of Tech Marine only trait, simply stating that Astartes vehicles within 6 inches gain lethal hits. If that's literally the full summary of the rule, and there's no other caveats or things necessary for it, then that's going to be really quite a good damage boost, and particularly because it could apply to an entire castle worth of Space Marine units firing. Seems like it could be extra good with Oath of Moment, seeing as you could reroll all the hits and try and fish for lethal ones, if that makes sense. And it looks like it could be particularly nice for lower or mid-strength attacks, maybe things like the Gladiator Reaper potentially with its mass volume fire. Lethal hits gets particularly standout good if you were only wounding on a 5 or 6 before. It's a bit of a leveler to make small arms a bit more bitey against hard targets. Seems very strong and pretty much auto-include if it's cheap enough, I guess. I feel like this could be really quite expensive and still be usable though, maybe even something like 40 points or so on a Tech Marine. They are fairly efficient for giving damage buffs already with the +1 to hit and the healing they can give for a vehicle. Seems like we've got a few more details from the stratagem side of things though. 3 different stratagems were mentioned for this detachment, 1 command point for one called Machine Spirit's Revenge, which I feel like that was lifting the name from a previous codex. This one happens when an Astartes vehicle with deadly demise gets killed, and it automatically triggers the rule on death. I must admit I do find the auto-explodes rules quite fun, and maybe it's not too surprising that this detachment has one of them. I think it's potentially really quite brutal in the right circumstances. Ideally, you'd want to have a Space Marine vehicle wading forward and then dying right in the thick of the enemy, and then surrounded by enemy units that you can hand out mortal wounds to every single one of. It's maybe a little bit balanced by the fact that most Space Marine vehicles don't generally tend to want to just charge headlong at the enemy. I guess best things for doing that might be things like the Redemptor Dreadnought or perhaps the Brutalis Dreadnought potentially. They've both got Deadly Demise D3. If you could have something like 3 or 4 enemy units within the blast range, then that could be worth it for 1 CP pretty easily though. It perhaps seems like it could be scarier for things like Repulsors or Land Raiders potentially. They've both got Deadly Demise D6. I feel like the stars would have to align fairly well though for those to die in the right place in the enemy army, and not to be in a position where they're just going to shower their own transport contents in mortal wounds as well, if the stuff that they transported had just got out to shoot or charge or something. I think it's definitely a nice to have one for a vehicle army though, if that's what this detachment is aimed to be. Next up, there's a 1 command point 1 called Ancient Fury. This one gets triggered in the command phase, and it targets a Space Marine walker of some sort. I guess we'll have to wait for the full text on the stratagem, but I suppose if it's a walker and not a dreadnought, then that could apply to the Invicta Tactical Warsuit. I guess that's the only Space Marine walker that isn't a dreadnought. In any case, for just 1 command point, you get to basically level up your dreadnought for 1 turn. +1 to the movement characteristic, +1 to the toughness, +1 to the save, +1 leadership, +1 objective control, and perhaps most importantly and reliably +1 to hit rolls until the next command phase. Overall, it's quite a powerful all-round buff package. I guess basically you'd see it on a dreadnought that needs to do a bit of heavy lifting this turn, and then hopefully some combination of that little lot gets it to do what it does best. I have to admit it's maybe a little bit less good than it sounds though. I feel like most of those buffs are a little bit on the marginal side. The movement, toughness, objective control, and leadership in a lot of cases might just not matter. And I must admit I'm a little bit unsure about how the save mechanic would work. I don't believe that you can improve a save beyond 2+, and I'm not sure whether or not that would come into effect before or after AP. +1 to hit on its own though is no bad thing for 1 CP on one of these powerful walkers. Just probably wouldn't be an auto use every turn though, if that's the main thing that you're getting out of it. Finally, for 1 CP, there's one that's apparently shoot back with an enemy vehicle. That one's a fairly common one within 10th edition rules at this point, though it looks like this one has an additional caveat that you can only use it if the vehicle was reduced to half strength or less by that attack. Again, maybe like the first one, that feels like a nice to have in an armoured army as opposed to something that you really build around. I guess if your opponent is damaging and destroying vehicles, then there's every chance they're going to do enough damage to take it to less than half health with something meaningful, and then you just get to slap them back with a bunch of damage. I could imagine, say, enemy units having to be pretty careful about trying to shoot down something like a Gladiator Lancer when you can threaten that, just in case you pay 1 CP to just have it turn around and blow them to bits straight after they've had the gall to inflict some damage on it. I guess if you got particularly lucky, you might have the chance for having the enemy unit reduce your vehicle to below half health, then inflict damage with the stratagem, and then repair it back up to threaten it again. That could be kind of funny if maybe a little bit unlikely if you happen to have Tech Marines around. Overall, so far this looks fun though. 3 interesting stratagems to help support vehicles, though I'd say most of them aren't usually going to be auto-use all the time. And a rule that just flatly increases damage a bit is rarely going to be a bad thing. I feel like that could compete against the Gladius mobility buffs if you just want raw firepower. Otherwise, going from armoured things into sneaky things, here we have the Vanguard Spearhead. This one's supposedly the Raven Guard and Sneaky Phobos type detachment, feeling fairly on the nose with the special rule that it gets, Shadow Masters for a -1 to hit and the benefit of cover for all units greater than 12 inches away. That's pretty close to being a carbon copy of the Raven Guard rule back in 9th edition, though I believe that one had a little bit more nuance to it, in that vehicles needed to be a bit further away and only got some of the benefits. Like in 9th edition, I feel like it's maybe interesting, but perhaps not going to be one of the most standout ones ever. It's basically a fairly good durability boost against range style armies, but won't really do anything at all against combat armies, making it a little bit of a matchup dependent type special rule, and even against range it might be a little bit less good than it used to be back in 9th edition, given that cover's generally really quite easy to acquire for a lot of units, and while the -1 to hit will be helpful, in 10th edition there's a load of effects like lethal hits and sustained hits that go off 6s, and this won't reduce those effects at all. Still though, against certain gun lines, and particularly ones that hit on a 4+ more than a 3+, this one is going to be nice. For the teased enhancement for this one, we've got something that sounds like it came out of the previous Vanguard Codex again. Give this one to an infantry character, and apparently the unit that they're leading get the Infiltrators keyword. Really quite a big deal if this does imply indeed to any infantry and not just a Phobos or anything. My guess is it will probably be any infantry, as quite a lot of Phobos can infiltrate or scout anyway, so it might just have less value for them. This one does sound like a special rule that we've heard of before, as it's very similar to the Genestealer Cult enhancement that allows you to infiltrate a big block of scary aberrants. I imagine it could have some pretty similar value for the Space Marines, with some big hefty units like 10-man Terminator blocks, Aggressors or Blade Guard or Eradicators or Hellblasters. Basically anything that has a good chance of inflicting some big damage on the enemy turn 1, but ideally is also fairly tanky as well, just in case you don't get first turn. I think it's still definitely pretty powerful though, even if you started something a bit forward and just hit it from line of sight in a mid-board ruin or something like that. Particularly with faster moving units, you could get an alpha strike from relative safety. I guess we'll have to wait and see just how good those jump assault intercessors can be. Potentially a unit of them led up by a jump captain could be pretty interesting maybe. I feel like on a lot of boards there's places that you could often put such a unit in relative safety, while still being a very big nuisance and threatening first turn charges. Finally for this one it seems that we have details on just 2 of the stratagems. First for 1 CP we've got Strike from the Shadows, again that sounds all very Raven Guard, and this one's a shooting buff applied to one of your units that's at least 12 inches away from the enemy unit that they're shooting. That unit gets a +1 to hit, an extra AP by 1, and if you kill any enemy models in the unit then they have to take a battle shock test after you resolve the shooting. For 1 command point that does seem really quite predictable and reliable. The +1 to hit is basically always going to be good value on ballistic skill 3+ stuff. An extra AP is usually going to be relevant, more often than not. The battle shock thing perhaps a little bit situational. Battle shock handed out in your own turn against the enemy is rarely all that meaningful. Definitely seems like an interesting one, that one, though I'm a little unsure as to what you might try and build around as an optimal target for it. I guess for maximising it, a big unit of something like Devastator Centurions might not actually be the worst. Otherwise, even though they have fairly high AP already, things like Hellblasters or Las Cannon Devastators could be alright with it. They feel like units that could still use the extra AP if they're targeting things like 3+ save vehicles or something, plus are maybe a bit more likely than most to be shooting at longer range. Finally, we've got one that feels like it's a bit more of a reprinted one, but maybe a bit of a standard for 40k guerrilla warfare type detachments, and this one is indeed called Guerrilla Tactics, and it's one of those abilities that allows you to return to strategic reserves. This particular one a bit better for Phobos units, either 2 Phobos units or 1 other infantry unit get to do this, and they have to be out of melee when they're doing so. I guess if you are going very themed and making heavy use of Phobos troops in the detachment, then that one could be really quite nice to redeploy 2 of them. Could potentially be fairly scary for lining up a whole load of eliminator shots exactly where your opponent doesn't want them, or getting other Phobos units jumping around the boards to do things like secondaries or threaten enemy units that would otherwise be completely safe. Beyond Phobos though, this could be pretty interesting on any ranged damage dealers with Deep Strike in particular. I guess you could maybe use it on Inceptors later in the game, maybe Deep Strike a big block of them somewhere where they can eliminate something and then stay safe, and then go back off into the sky to perform another Alpha Strike the next turn. Could be interesting for redeploying big Terminator units as well, if one did happen to find itself out of position late game, I suppose. I guess this could also be used for potential first turn Alpha Strikes as well. Say you start a deep striking type unit on the board and then use it at the end of the opponent's first turn if they go first. You could have a first turn deep strike unit to help the unit that you set up the board if you wanted, maybe doubling down on the Raven Guard style Alpha Strike things that they've had in editions past. That's it for today, but I feel like those 2 detachments are at least fairly interesting. Both of them look like they could be interesting for building a Space Marine army in really quite a different way. I feel like out of these leaked rules, if they do turn out to be accurate, the single rerolls seem quite useful over an entire army, and I do quite like that Tech Marine trait that gives lethal hits. Otherwise, for the Vanguard type detachment, being able to infiltrate a massive great big threatening unit seems very scary indeed. I feel like that would be a pretty popular option for them. Hopefully we'll have some more news in the not too distant future, and hopefully we get these confirmed one way or the other with Games Workshop's previews quite soon. If we're lucky, they might tease some other stratagems and enhancements and stuff, I guess. In any case, I'll certainly cover any more news that we get for Space Marine Codex when we do receive it, and I look forward to doing a full review of the book when we do get the rules. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see either or both of those. Finally, seeing as we've got Space Marines coming in the not too distant future, I thought I'd just mention the channel's October giveaway once more for the chance to win a huge amount of Space Marines from the new Codex. Given that the Marines are getting quite a big release wave, I thought it might be fun to make the October prize basically one copy of all the Marines that were showcased at Games Workshop's Nova Open. So that's basically 5 Jump Intercessors, 5 Terminators, 5 Stern Guard, and 5 Heroes of the Chapter, the Terminator Chaplain and Captain, 5 Scouts, and the Jump Captain and the new Codex. There'll be 3 winners for that little lot this time round, and as with the other channel giveaways, there's 2 equal ways to enter, both of them links down in the video description below. Firstly, you can support the channel via Patreon, which is what allows me to keep on making these videos all this time. Channel patrons of any amount gets to enter for free each month. Or alternatively, you can support the channel via social media, subscribing to the YouTube channel and liking the Facebook page, and then for the actual entry to the draw itself, a comment appears on the Facebook page on the 1st of October, reply to that with a photo of any 40k miniature or any imagery, along with your name and the date handwritten within the photo. The last bit is just to deter any Facebook bots and spammers and make sure the prize goes to a real hobbyist. Then when all the entries are in, I put all the names into a random number generator, both Patreon and Facebook equally. Each person gets one chance, and the winners of the draw get announced on the channel update video on YouTube around about the 4th of October. At this point in time, of course, we're still not 100% sure when the Space Marines are actually going to come out, but they'll be posted to you basically when I receive the order of them that I make from Games Workshop or independent stockists. In any case though, check out the links down in the video description for either the Patreon or the Facebook page if you'd like to enter for that. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening. Looking forward to talking more Space Marine rules when we get news of them. Hopefully we'll get some more complete looks at detachments in the not too distant future, and hopefully Games Workshop managed to land a codex that's pretty well balanced between the different chapters and their detachments, and not too underpowered despite the nerf to Oath of moment. A massive thank you to each and every one of you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.